Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Creating the Chicago Location. In this video, we're going to start off by talking about how to add a child domain. We're going to talk about sites and subnets. We're going to be configuring replication with our DCs over in New York. So a lot of stuff in this one, so let's go ahead and let's jump right in here. In this video, we're going to talk about, first of all, that in order to create a child domain, all you need is a DC. And in that instance, we also need to add a site and a subnet object before we jump headlong in. So I'm going to talk to you about really what sites and subnets do for us, because they can be very, very handy in tracking the physical location of our machines. So some pretty cool stuff. Then, in this particular section where I'm going to be talking you through creating the child domain, I don't really have any slides for that per se, but we're just going to jump in and show you how to do it. And then we're also going to make sure that Chicago can talk to New York. We're going to go in and actually configure replication between the Chicago domain controller we're going to be building in this video and our domain controller over in New York. All right, so here's the deal. It's really time to expand because Hank feels that in order to keep tabs on the Chicago markets, he needs to open up an office in downtown Chicago. So in order to keep your network a little more manageable, you decide that the best way to keep Globomantics in check, really, and also to prepare for some future growth, we need to separate out the Chicago office into its own little child domain. Sometimes you might hear this called, by the way, a subdomain. But you know, there are some really good reasons why you might want to break out a particular location into its domain, especially if it's halfway across the country. First of all, when you break out something into its own domain, we really are creating less network traffic between the two sites, okay? So we want to make sure that we're reserving our bandwidth between Chicago and New York for actual work. We don't want a lot of network traffic going over the wide area network link because it's going to suck up our bandwidth, and when people from Chicago try to access stuff from New York, we want their experience to be as good as possible. And if we're still keeping the Chicago office in the globomantics.com domain, well, there's going to be some of that bandwidth that's going to be used up for things like replication and DNS queries and all this other stuff. So creating less network traffic over a wide area network link is really a major reason why we might want to do this. Decentralized management. Yeah, we want to be able to pass the buck to some other administrator that's actually in Chicago. We don't want to have to administrate Chicago from New York, because if something goes wrong directly with the hardware, what are you going to do? You know, hop on a flight every time a network cable's unplugged? I don't think so. So we need to get somebody in Chicago, and we might send Jamie or we might hire somebody else. But when we have a separate domain, we can give an administrator power over only that domain. So we might want to retain the enterprise administrator level credentials, but then we'll turn around and we'll give, say, Jamie, let's say we're going to send him out there for a while, we'll give him domain credentials over only the Chicago office. And last but not least, if we set up a location-centric Active Directory structure, in this situation, it really can allow for easier tracking of stuff between locations. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk to you about sites and subnets and how you can use those tools in order to use the location attribute in Active Directory. It's going to allow us to be able to find stuff per location a whole lot easier. Not to mention also the issues of file servers and print servers. We'll know exactly which file servers are in Chicago, which file servers are in New York. And these are little things that when you're initially thinking about planning a network, they may not necessarily spring to your mind until you're smack dab in the middle of it, and you're like, wow, where is that file server? I don't know, So we want to set up our network and do a little bit of planning ahead of time so that we can actually find stuff a little more easy. Now, here's the deal. In order to create the Chicago child domain, all that we really need is another domain controller. Now, at this point in time, we have been building the globomantics.com domain. Now, of course, this office is in New York, right? And so we have built out 3 domain controllers to handle all of our wrestling matches in New York. But now we're ready to create a subdomain, and we're going to be creating this domain. We're going to call it na.globomantics.com. Now, NA, by the way, stands for North America. Okay, kind of a standard little item, and it makes our name shorter because Globomantics is long anyway. Now, we're going to have a wide area link directly from Globomantics over to the Chicago office, all right? Now, most of the time, our wide area links are not as fast. We don't have as much bandwidth going from Chicago to New York, okay? So, this might be a smaller line. This might only be a T1 line, or it might even be a DSL. We don't know. But we're going to have probably a smaller amount of bandwidth to play with. Not to mention, we want to keep our costs down as time goes on, too. So again, in order to use this small amount of bandwidth well, we're going to want to you'll set up a child domain so we're not pushing so much busy work traffic over this link. All right, now, in order to create our na.globalmatics.com, what we're going to do is we're going to be setting up another domain controller. Now, just so you know, this next domain controller, I've already installed Windows Server 2008. I have done all the basic configuration for it. We're just going to jump in and actually configure Active Directory domain services, okay? So we're going to be naming this particular computer NA-DC1-2K8. This machine is going to be a global catalog, and it's also going to be a DNS server. So that way, all of the machines here in our Globalmatics Chicago shop are going to be able to find stuff using this domain controller. That way, if a computer, let's say we have a computer, this is a beautiful little computer, isn't it? Look at this artwork. Beautiful. All right, so let's say we have a computer who's looking for a file server and it doesn't know where it's at. Well, we have two options. If we don't have the na.globalmatics.com domain, then this little computer is always going to be calling up to one of our DNS servers up here, and we're going to get DNS traffic back and forth all the time. And that's going to be sucking up our bandwidth. Well, we don't want that to happen. What we want to happen is, looks like I erased my little computer here. Let me put it back. That's an even better looking computer, isn't it? We want this little computer to talk to the DNS server that's in that particular domain, specifically even in that particular location. So we're going to want this DNS server to be here. And by the way, we are going to be using Active Directory integrated DNS just to make our lives simple and to allow Active Directory to manage most of the DNS stuff for us. So at the end of the day, this is what we're going to be creating. And by building this domain controller and using DC Promer, we're going to be creating this particular child domain. All right, now before we start building this machine, though, we need to do a little preparation in the globalmatics.com domain proper. Before we begin, we need to create a site, okay? Now, what a site in Active Directory, what it does is it represents your physical structure, oftentimes called the topology of your network. And by now, you should know what the word topology means. It just means the physical structure of your network. Right now, all that we have in our network is the Globalmatics. In the globalmatics.com, we have the New York site, right? Now, here's the deal. We need to create another site. We need to create the Chicago site in Active Directory Sites and Services. So that way we can use our tools that are available to us so we can create a subnet object as well. We want Active Directory to be able to track machines according to their location. And we actually use subnets for that kind of thing. And I'm actually going to show you how to set up a subnet and the whole 9 yards on this one. But then once we create this subnet object, we are going to assign that subnet object to Chicago. And just so you know, none of this stuff is very hard, okay? It's a lot of right-clicking, literally. So don't be too intimidated yet. Once you see me go in and do this, you're going to be like, wow, it's that easy? Yeah, it's really that easy. All right, so once we have our site created for Chicago, once we have a subnet object created for Chicago, which is going to take a little bit of network planning, by the way, we need to decide what our network addressing scheme is going to be ahead of time. But then we can use the location attribute, and I'll show you where that's at in Active Directory, in order to track and find machines according to their IP addresses. It's very cool. So here's what we have, and here's what we're going to be creating in terms of our sites, okay? Right now we have one site, right, New York, and in the New York site we have DC1, DC2, and NYDC3. Now we can pretty much call this set done, right? We have got that taken care of. So now we need to create another site for Chicago, and we're going to be putting our DC1 machine in Chicago. And then we're also going to be creating a subnet object, and we're going to be attaching it to Chicago, so that way Active Directory can track the locations of all the machines in Chicago according to their IP address. Okay, so it's a very cool little tool. And again, I'm actually going to show you how this is all done step by step. You can see the end results here as well. So I've given you a little bit of front loading, and I know it might look a little daunting at this point in time, but once you go in and watch me do this, you're going to see, wow, this is really pretty easy stuff. So let's go ahead and let's go on over, first of all, to our DC2 server. And the reason why we're going to go to DC2 is that we have put most of our domain roles and such on DC2, and quite honestly, we could do the site work and subnet work on any one of the DCs. It doesn't make any difference. It's just that I haven't, messed with DC2 much, and so I think it should get a little bit of screen time too. So let's go ahead and let's bounce on over there. We're going to be going through our client 1 in remote desktop to get to DC2 and make this all happen. All right, so here we are over on client 1, and we're going to go into DC2 via remote desktop. And so here we are, of course, in the server manager, and we're going to go into our Active Directory domain services. Now let me go ahead and stretch this guy out here again. There we go. We're going to go into sites and services this time in order to create our Chicago site. So that way we have a site ready to accept and put our new domain controller into so we can track where our machines are at, right? So I'm going to right click here on sites, and I'm going to click on new site. Yeah, it's that easy. Okay, now we are going to create the Chicago site by typing Chicago, and now we need to select a site link. Okay, now we're just going to go ahead and use the default IP site link. That'll be just fine, and tell it OK. Now that site link, all it really does is basically links the sites together. Just as a kind of in a nutshell. All right, so now it's telling me that site Chicago has been created. To finish configuration of Chicago, ensure that Chicago is linked to other sites with site links as appropriate. We're going to be doing that once we actually have Chicago there, all right? And we're going to be setting up our replication for our domain controllers. We're going to be needing to add subnets for Chicago, and then we're also going to need to install at least one domain controller in Chicago to create that na.globalmatics.com. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and tell this guy OK, and now here is Chicago. Now, what I need to do now in order to be able to track and make sure that I can locate machines in Chicago according to their IP address, I'm going to go here to subnets. You'll see that right now there are no subnets, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to new subnet. There we go. Now really all I have to really do for this is I just need to put in a prefix. Now basically the prefix, as you see, here is the IP version, for example. Basically we have the first 3 octets and then a 0/ whatever the CIDR notation happens to be. Now if you're not familiar with subnets, it's time to go back and review, okay? Time to go back and pick up your Network Plus book. But the subnet that we're going to be using is 192.168.5.0, okay? We're going to be using a CIDR notation of /26. That's going to give us 4 subnets, by the way, that are really 4 networks that we can play with. And now I'm going to make sure that I can attach this subnet to Chicago. I'm going to tell it OK. All right, so, and that's all I needed to do. It's really that easy. You create the site, you create the subnet with the subnet prefix, and again, at this point in time, you should have knowledge of subnets. It's kind of a prerequisite for this kind of course. Now you can always go in here and go into the properties of the subnet in case you need to make alterations to it. But we're going to be using the location attribute for this later on. But again, let's go ahead and let's start small. Okay, let's first of all, we've created the ability to add a new domain controller and define the Chicago site already. So let's go ahead now and let's install the domain controller to this new site. Now before we do that, let me show you here in New York, I have my servers underneath my New York site. Here are my 3 servers for New York, DC1, DC2, DC3. In Chicago, when we go into servers, we got nothing. Okay, so we now need to create that server and attach it to Chicago. So let's go ahead and move on over to our brand new server. We're not going to be going to it through remote desktop. We're just going to go to the machine directly. All right, so here we are on NADC1-2K8, And I'm going to go ahead and log in as the local administrator. All I have done to this machine so far is I have installed Server 2008, obviously, blinding flash of the obvious. I have renamed the machine. I have given it an IP address, and that's pretty much it. I mean, I've done a little bit of configuration to it, but nothing. It has no roles attached to it whatsoever. It's pretty much just a clean machine. So it's going to open up the server manager because I have already performed the ICT, the initial configuration task list on it. And I've turned off the initial configuration task list because, as you know, it kind of annoys me. So let's go ahead and let's go to the roles section now. And let's add the Active Directory Domain Services role. Remember, in order to create the Chicago domain, na.globalmantics.com, we have to create a domain controller running Active Directory Domain Services. And we'll tell it next. And we'll go ahead and we will let this run for a little bit. I'm going to pause the recording. I know, like we always do, right? And then I'll be right back as soon as this guy's done, and we'll run through DC promo. All right, so Active Directory Domain Services has installed A-OK. Let's go ahead and let's run through DC promo real quick. We've done this before, but we're going to make a couple of alterations in the steps we're taking in order to add that na.globalmantics.com domain. Now, we could go ahead and use advanced mode installation if we like. It's not going to be really that necessary, though, at this point in time, because we don't really need any of the options that are available in the advanced mode. So we're going to be creating a domain controller in an existing forest, but this time we're going to be creating a new domain in an existing forest. Okay, so we'll select that guy, and we'll tell it next. And so now we type the name of our domain that we're going to be adding the item to, globalmantics.com, and of course we need to set our alternate credentials. So I'm going to click on Set, and I'm going to put on here Supercoach, and of course putting in the password and telling it OK. All right, now I'm going to tell it next, and it's going to sit here and look at the Active Directory, and of course it's going to ask us for the fully qualified domain name of the parent. Now if I click Browse, of course all we really have right now is Globalmantics, right? So we'll tell it OK. And now for the single labeled DNS name of the child domain, all I'm going to type in here is NA. So that way, as you see down here at the bottom in the fully qualified domain name of the new child domain, we have na.globalmantics.com. So the fully qualified domain name of our server is eventually going to be na-dc1-2k8.na.globalmantics.com. I'll show you that as soon as we finish this process and we add this machine. Because remember, I did not add this machine to the domain yet, right? The reason is that when we're creating a new domain controller for a new domain, we don't add it to the old domain. Okay, we don't need to. All right, so now we'll go ahead and we'll tell it next. And it's going to sit here and look around and make sure that domain name is valid. Make sure that that domain name does not already exist. And I can tell you that it doesn't because, well, we haven't created it yet, right? I mean, you've seen pretty much everything that I've done along the way. All right, so now we're going to put a check mark here and use the site that corresponds to the IP address of this computer. All right, now we're going to go ahead and leave it be because we do want this machine to be in the Chicago site, right? Because we just created Chicago. We want to make sure that we have this machine in the Chicago location. Now, if I wanted to put it in New York, I could uncheck it and I could put it in New York, but I don't want to. So even if I uncheck it, I can still select Chicago. It doesn't make any difference. But if you have a lot of sites, this might be really helpful to you. All right, we'll go ahead and tell it next. And now we get to decide whether or not this guy is going to be a DNS server and global catalog. Well, we want this one to be both, okay? We want it to be a DNS server for na.globalmantics.com, so that way we're not having to use our wide area network bandwidth to do DNS stuff. Although we're going to have to use a little bit of it, because, well, since this DNS server is going to be Active Directory integrated, it's still going to need to talk to New York at some points in time, but we're going to configure that later. So hang on to that thought for just a moment. Let's go ahead and finish this one up. We do want it to be a global catalog. Now, we don't have to make it a global catalog, but you'll notice here that it gives us a warning. Okay, so we want it to, we do want this guy to be a global catalog, to have at least a partial copy of everything else that's in the domain for NA. All All right, so we'll tell it next. And now, again, same old here. Where's the database going to live? Where are the log files going to live? Where's the sysfile going to live? All good there. We'll tell it next. Now we need to set up the domain or the directory services restore mode password. So we'll go ahead and we'll do that real quick. And just so we have a backup of what we've done, I'm going to go ahead and export the settings. And I'm going to put in here NA answer file just to give it a quick name. All right. And now I'm going to go ahead and tell it next. And basically sit back and let it do its thing. I'll have it reboot on completion. And I'm going to pause the recording. And as soon as this guy is wrapped up, I'll come back and I'll show you what we've accomplished. All right, so our machine has rebooted now. So let's go ahead and let's do a Control-Alt-Delete here to log on. So let's go ahead and let's do that here real quick. We'll log in as the... And remember, when you create a domain controller and a new domain, your domain administrator password is the same as your local administrator password at this point in time. Now, obviously, that's one of those things that we really should go in and we should do a couple of quick changes on, right? Because we don't want to leave our administrator username for North America to be, well, administrator. So we're going to wait here just a second for our server manager to pop up. And there we go. And wait for just a second while it populates all of the different little MMCs that are in there. Let's go into the roles section now. And we should, of course, see Active Directory Domain Services. There we go. And so now let's go into the users and computers and let's see what we have so far. Hey, there we go. There's our na.globamatics.com domain. Now, right now, we really don't have much in here. We don't really have anything attached to this domain. We have a domain controller, and that's pretty much it. That is a global catalog. The users, all we really have are the basic built-in users. And remember, we should probably change this one, right? So let's go ahead and let's right-click and change the administrator name so we have something else other than administrator. So let's call this Chicago Supercoach. And of course we could change it later on if we so desired. And I'll just copy and paste this in here real quick. And I'll go ahead and I'll also specify that I need to change my password at the next logon and tell it OK. At this point, I really should log off and log back on, but let's just take a quick look around and see what we have going on here first. Let's go into the Active Directory Sites and Services section, and we'll go into Sites, and hey, here's Chicago, and here's New York. All right, neat. Let's go ahead and let's expand Chicago and take a look and see. Here's our one server in Chicago. We'll go ahead and expand that. We'll expand the NADC1 settings here. And what we see here, this guy right here, let me go ahead and I'm going to right click on this guy and go into its properties. This is the properties of our link. This is our connection object to everybody else, okay? So what you see here, underneath here where it says replicate from, right now we are getting stuff from New York DC1 2K8. So New York DC1 is actually our current replication partner. So the stuff that happens in New York, the stuff that happens in Chicago, NADC1 will talk to NYDC1. So we can keep up and see what's happening on both machines. Now I'm going to click here on Change Schedule. Now here's where we can actually decide when the two machines can talk. So we can actually set specific times. So if we click here on the little blue one, these guys are only talking early mornings and really kind of, they're talking several times a day, 8 to 9, 11 to 12, 2 to 3, 11 to 12 a.m. So we can decide when these guys are actually going to be talking. Now, by the way, you could probably leave this alone and it's probably going to be okay. Right? I mean, you don't have to do anything with this if you don't want to. You're probably not going to be sucking up that much bandwidth during the course of the day. However, we could go ahead and select all the little squares here and tell it none, and that will clear out all of the communication times. And now we can go in and we can set the times that we want them to talk each and every day. So let's say that we want our domain controllers to talk to each other only from 11 p.m. to midnight. Okay, so I could go ahead and I could select this entire column, Sunday through Saturday, and I could have them talk, let's say, twice per hour. Okay, because well, there's nobody. Or at least there shouldn't be anybody working that late. I mean, there might be, but if there's only 1 or 2 people working and we're replicating, our replication isn't going to take that much time. So every day from 11 to 12, our 2 domain controllers will talk twice, and that's it. We'll tell it okay. Now we could also decide to replicate to a different domain controller. Right now we're replicating to DC1, and that's going to be okay. I mean, we could probably have DC1 catch all of our changes and any pertinent information that it needs, and then have DC1 communicate those changes out to the other 2 domain controllers. Now, let's go ahead and click on the change button. And you know what? Since DC2 is now our primary domain controller emulator, remember how in a previous video we moved the PDC emulator master over to DC2? Well, let's go ahead and let's have DC2 then talk directly to our new domain controller here. Does it really make that much difference in which domain controller you select? Not so much. I mean, over time, all the domain controllers are going to talk anyway, and they're all going to replicate their entries in their database to each other. So, I mean, we're going to be pretty good no matter which domain controller we select. All right, so what we have done is we have actually configured how and when these 2 domain controllers are going to be talking via the properties. I'm going to go ahead and tell this guy OK, via the properties of this connection object here. And it's going to tell me this connection is automatically generated by Active Directory Domain Services. Changes to this connection will be overwritten unless the object is marked as not automatically generated. Do you wish to mark this connection as not automatically generated? Yes, I do. We'll go ahead and tell it yes. And now you see that this connection object, which again, this connection object, what it does is it defines how our 2 domain controllers are going to talk, and it defines their partnership. It defines the fact that NADC1 is a replication partner with New York DC2 at this point in time, and they talk only from 11 p.m. to midnight every day, twice an hour. All right, so this one is pretty much all set. We're going to go ahead and we're going to move back over now to DC1, and let's see, or maybe I think we were on DC2, right? Yeah, we were on DC2 over on Client 1. So let's go ahead, let's move back on over there and see what things are looking like in Active Directory in globalmantics.com now that we've added this new domain. All right, so here we are back on NYDC2, and we have our Chicago object, and let's see if we can't get this guy to refresh here. I want to press the F5 key to make sure that it can actually see. Oh, there we are. Okay, well now here's NADC1. And so we now have a connective object so our domain controllers can talk once again. We go into NADC1 here. Here's our NTDS settings. Now you will notice here in the NTDS settings, we got no settings. We got no connection. I'm going to press the F5 key here. There we go. Okay, so now here's our NTDS settings. And by the way, NTDS, Network Directory Service, right? Okay, just to make sure that you remember that. Right, I hit F5 so I could refresh the settings in this so we can see that our connection that we configured over on NADC1 is showing up. All right, so our connection object is intact, and we're in pretty much good shape here. I mean, we have configured Chicago and now has a server. Our machines have the ability to talk to each other. Again, they're only going to talk to each other twice an hour, exactly from 11 p.m. to 12 a.m. Okay? All right, so we have successfully created our Chicago domain. And by the way, if we wanted to manage the Chicago Globalmantics or the Chicago NA.globalmantics from here, I could right-click on the globalmantics.com domain. I could change domain controller. Oops, just kidding. Cancel that. I could change the domain. All right, and so I'll click on Browse. And I'll expand Globalmantics, and I can select na.globalmantics.com and tell it OK. And now I have access to the na.globalmantics stuff from over here on NYDC2 in New York in the Globalmantics domain. So the very cool thing about having all the stuff connected in together is that you can manage your Chicago office domain controller from here sitting at your desk in New York. And you know what? We didn't even need to open up a remote desktop, did we? All we had to do is right click on the domain and click on change domain. Now, by the way, we would probably click on change domain controller if we had another domain controller, if we wanted to do that as well, but you get the point, right? So let's go ahead and let's change back over to Globomantics. So that way when we go back here to DC2, we don't have to go back and play hopscotch and get back to this particular domain. All right, so everything's looking good at this point in time. So let's go ahead and let's bounce on over to the slides and let's do some wrap up. All right, so let's go through some critical vocabulary here real quick. And first of all, of course, we did the whole child domain thing. And that is a subdomain that is part of the main forest and it's useful for delegation of management, location-based management, and saving bandwidth over WAN links. We talked about that. Sites, an Active Directory object that represents the major components of your physical topology of your network. And last but not least, we did do a subnet object too, right? And that's an Active Directory object that allows AD to track machines based on their IP address. And we saw an instance of that whenever we created our new child domain based upon the IP address of the machine and the fact that it fit in the subnet that we had established. It automatically put our NADC1 into the Chicago site. Alright, so after viewing this video, you should be able to do the following things. You should be able to create a new site in Active Directory, and again, that's a right click, right? Create a new subnet object in Active Directory, and that one you're going to need to know what subnet you're actually going to be creating. Yeah? You also know how to assign a subnet object to a site because it's built right into the creation process. We saw how to use DC promo to create a new child domain in an existing forest. And also, I took you into sites and services and showed you how to configure replication between domain controllers. I saw that that wasn't that hard. We just decide which domain controller is going to be partnered with which, and at what time those two domain controllers are going to be talking. All right. Well, Chicago has now been established, so what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to be setting up some users and, of course, organizing them into groups. But I'm going to bring into the whole mix this thing called universal groups. We're really going to start in talking about the whole what kind of groups should we be creating and how you can use groups to grant access in different domains. So it's going to be really good stuff, especially if you're dealing with multiple locations. So stay tuned and I will see you in that one.